Think about the last time something truly unfair happened to you. Not a small inconvenience, and not a bad day at work. Something genuinely, unmistakably unfair. A diagnosis that came out of nowhere. A relationship that ended when it had no right to. A loss you never once saw coming. And think about what people said to you in that moment. Maybe they said, "Everything happens for a reason," or "God has a plan," or, "The one that cuts the deepest, you must have done something to deserve this." For most people, those words don't help. And somewhere underneath the gratitude you may have felt for the company, you knew that they weren't quite the full truth. They were the safe answer, the tidy answer, the answer that makes everyone else comfortable while leaving you, quietly, completely, alone with your pain. The book of Job is the only book in the Bible that looks all of that directly in the face and refuses to look away. It is probably the oldest book in the Bible, certainly the strangest, and it may be the one that speaks most directly to the life you have actually lived. Not the life you were supposed to have, but the real one, with all its confusion, its grief, and its unanswered questions. By the end of this video, you will understand why God called Job right, even while Job was accusing him. You will understand why the ending of the book doesn't actually undo its honesty. And you will understand the one question that Job's 3 friends, for all their wisdom and eloquence, never once thought to ask. What kind of book is this? Before we get into what happens, it is worth understanding what we are actually dealing with. Job is not a simple story with a moral at the end. It is not a history book, a book of laws, or a collection of prophecies. It belongs to a category scholars call wisdom literature, the same family as Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, books that wrestle with the deep structural questions of human experience rather than telling the stories of kings or recording divine commands. But even within that family, Job stands completely alone. The book introduces its subject plainly and without ceremony. Job 1:1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. He is not an Israelite. He has no connection to Abraham, to Moses, or to the covenant tradition that runs through the rest of the Hebrew Bible. He is simply a man. And that seems to be entirely deliberate on the author's part, to make this story universal, to place it outside any single nation or tradition, so that it belongs, by definition, to all of humanity. He is also, by every measure available to the ancient world, a good man. 7 sons, 3 daughters, thousands of livestock, the greatest man in all the East, and morally blameless, a man who has done everything right, who has lived exactly as he was supposed to live. The whole book is about to take that belief, that goodness leads to blessing, that right living earns right circumstances, and test it without mercy, without sentiment, and without giving you an easy way out. One more thing worth knowing before we begin. The book of Job is written in 2 completely different styles that sit side by side in a way that has puzzled readers for centuries. There is a prose prologue at the beginning and a prose epilogue at the end, simple, almost fable-like in their directness. And sandwiched between them is a massive, sprawling poem, 35 chapters of some of the finest writing in all of ancient literature, in which Job and his friends argue, challenge, and search for answers. The poem and the prose almost seem to tell different stories. Together, they give you the tidy frame, and then break it apart from the inside. The prologue, the courtroom in heaven. The story begins, perhaps surprisingly, in heaven. God is holding what the text calls a meeting of the sons of God, a divine assembly, something like a royal court. And among them is a figure the Hebrew text calls Satan, which is not a name but a title, a job description. It means the adversary, or the accuser. In this scene, he functions less like the embodiment of evil we find in later Christian tradition and more like a prosecuting attorney, a skeptic in the divine court, whose job is to challenge and to question. God mentions Job first, and with something that sounds almost like pride. Job 1:8. Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man? And the adversary responds with the question that drives the entire book. Job 1:9-10. Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a hedge around him? The argument is simple and devastating. Of course Job is faithful. Look at his life. You have built a wall of blessing around him. Take it all away, and then see what he says about you. God allows it. That is the moment that troubles almost every reader who encounters this story seriously for the first time. And so, in rapid, merciless succession, Job loses his oxen, his donkeys, his sheep, his camels, and all his servants. And then, in a single day, he loses all 10 of his children when the house they are feasting in collapses on them. Job tears his robe, he shaves his head, he falls to the ground, and he says, Job 1:21, Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. The adversary is still not satisfied. He returns to the divine court and argues that a man will give up everything to save his own body. God permits a second test. Job is struck with painful sores from head to foot. He sits in the ashes, scraping himself with a broken piece of pottery. His wife, who has lost everything alongside him and whose grief the text almost cruelly passes over in a single line, says to him, Curse God and die. And Job answers her, Job 2:10, Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? Then his 3 friends arrive, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And when they see him, they do the one thing they will get entirely right in the entire book. They sit down beside him on the ground, and they say nothing for 7 days, because there are simply no words for what they are looking at. Then Job opens his mouth, and what comes out is not the patient, resigned man of the first 2 chapters. The breaking point of Job. After 7 days of silence, Job speaks, and the words that come out are raw, honest, and completely unfiltered. He does not thank God. He does not ask for healing. He curses the day he was born. Job 3:3, Let the day perish on which I was born. He wishes he had never come into existence. He longs for death the way a man longs for buried treasure. And he asks, with an honesty that cuts across 3,000 years, the question that millions of people have asked in hospital rooms and in the early hours of sleepless mornings. Job 3:20-21, Why is light given to him who is in misery, and life to the bitter in soul, who long for death, but it comes not? Stop and sit with that for a moment. That is not a verse you will find on a greeting card. That is not the kind of language most religious traditions know quite what to do with. But it is brutally, recognizably, unmistakably human. And anyone who has sat with real suffering, their own or someone else's, will recognize it immediately. Here is the crucial thing. The author of Job does not treat this outburst as a failure of faith. He does not interrupt the poem to note that Job sinned by saying this, or that this anger was itself a kind of wrongdoing. He lets Job speak. He gives Job's honesty the full weight and space it deserves. And that is the line that runs through this entire video. The line I want you to hold in your mind. The honest cry is more faithful than the pious silence. Job is not failing here. He is telling the truth. The friends, and why they get it wrong. Job's 3 friends each take their turn, and at first they seem entirely reasonable. They are educated men. They care about Job. They have traveled to be with him, and they believe, genuinely, that they are helping. But the theology they offer is simple to the point of being brutal. Suffering is the consequence of sin. If you are suffering, you did something wrong. Confess it, repent, and the suffering will end. The logic seems clean and even compassionate. The problem is that it does not match the reality standing directly in front of them. Eliphaz, the gentlest of the 3, goes first, speaking carefully of a vision he has received and suggesting that no truly innocent person suffers this way. Bildad is blunter, arguing that God is just and therefore Job must be guilty. Zophar is the harshest of all. He tells Job he should be grateful because he is probably receiving less than he actually deserves. Job argues back, at length, with a force and precision that grows sharper with every exchange. He does not quietly accept their explanations. He does not bow his head and search himself for hidden sins. At one point, he turns to them and says something that should stop every reader in their tracks. Job 13, 7-8. Will you speak falsely for God? Will you plead the case for God? He is accusing his friends, in the plainest possible terms, of being God's public relations team, of defending a comfortable theological system at the expense of the truth that is standing right in front of them, of choosing the safe answer over the honest one. Think about how many times in your own life you have been offered the safe answer when what you actually needed was the honest one. And then, in a passage that may be the most remarkable statement of faith in the entire Old Testament, Job says this, Job 13:15, "Though he slay me, I will hope in him, yet I will argue my ways to his face." Read that again, slowly. He is not saying, "I trust that everything will be fine." He is not saying, "I accept God's will with peace in my heart." He is saying, "Even if this kills me, I will not let go, and I will still stand before God and make my case." That is not comfortable faith. That is not easy faith. That is the faith of a man who is furious and broken and refuses, against all reason, against all evidence, to walk away. As the debates continue across chapter after chapter, Job grows bolder still. He demands a hearing. He says that if he could only get God into a courtroom, he would make his case and be vindicated. And then, in one of the most moving passages in the entire book, he holds on to something that feels almost like hope. Job 19:25-26. "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God." Even at his absolute lowest, scraping himself in the ashes, abandoned by his friends, arguing with a God who will not answer, Job holds on to the conviction that he will not be forgotten forever. A young voice. Before God speaks, a fourth figure appears, one who has not been mentioned before. His name is Elihu, and he is young. He has been sitting and listening through all the debates, growing increasingly frustrated, angry at Job for what he sees as arrogance, and angry at the three friends for failing to answer Job properly. And now, at length, he speaks. Elihu offers a more sophisticated version of the friends' argument, that God uses suffering not simply to punish, but to instruct and purify, to speak to human beings through pain when they would not listen any other way. It is a more nuanced position, but it is still not enough for Job. What is most striking about Elihu is what the book does with him afterward. Nothing. God never addresses him. He is neither vindicated nor rebuked. He simply disappears without acknowledgement, and scholars have debated his purpose ever since. What Elihu does accomplish, without knowing it, is prepare the stage for what comes next. His final speech describes a gathering storm, wind, thunder, lightning, the sky darkening on the horizon. And then, right in the middle of his words, the wind arrives in earnest. A whirlwind. The voice from the whirlwind. This is the moment the entire book has been building toward. Job has demanded a hearing for 35 chapters. He has asked, in every way he knows how, for God to show up and explain himself. And now, out of a whirlwind, a violent roaring storm, God speaks. But God does not answer Job's questions, not a single one. What God does instead is ask questions of his own. And they are not gentle questions. They are vast, sweeping, and almost overwhelming in their scope. God begins, Job 38:4. "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding." And it goes on for 4 full chapters. Question after question, each one pointing to something so far beyond human comprehension or control that Job can only fall silent. Job 38:31. "Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades or loose the cords of Orion? The sea, the morning, snow, lightning, the feeding habits of lions, the birth of mountain goats." God walks Job through the entire created order, the wild, uncontrollable, magnificent world that existed long before Job was born and will go on long after he is gone. On one level, this is humbling to the point of crushing. God is saying, "You are small, You do not have the vantage point to judge the whole. You cannot even explain how the morning works. How exactly do you propose to put me on trial? But here is what many readers miss when they first encounter this passage. God never tells Job that his questions were faithless. God never says that Job was wrong to ask, or that his anger was sinful, or that his demands were inappropriate. God shows up. God speaks directly to Job by name out of the storm. And in the world in which this book was written, that is not a small thing. That is a response. That is encounter. Job replies twice. The first time, briefly, Job 44, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. The second time, after God has spoken again, more fully, Job 42, 5. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. That line is perhaps the most important in the entire book. I had heard of you. That is second-hand faith. The faith of childhood, of what you were taught before life had a chance to test it. The faith that comes from other people's accounts of God, other people's experiences, other people's certainties. But now my eye sees you. That is first-hand faith, the faith that has been through something, the faith that costs something. Job does not say, now I understand. He does not say, now it all makes sense. He says, now I have encountered you directly, and that is entirely different from everything that came before. The honest cry, once again, has proven more faithful than the pious silence. The ending that troubles everyone. Now we come to the epilogue, and this is where many careful, thoughtful readers feel a new kind of unease. God turns to Eliphaz, the leader of the three friends, and says something that should reframe everything that has come before. Job 42:7. My anger burns against you, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. God vindicates Job. Job, who argued, who demanded a hearing, who accused God of hiding from him, who said he longed for death. God says, Job spoke what was right. The friends, with all their careful, pious, theologically tidy explanations, they were wrong. That is one of the most remarkable statements in the entire Bible. It means that honest wrestling with God, even angry, raw, relentless wrestling, is somehow closer to faithfulness than the comfortable, defensive answers that protect a neat system at the expense of truth. And then God restores Job. His health returns. His fortunes are doubled. He has more livestock than before, 7 new sons, 3 new daughters. He lives another 140 years and sees 4 generations of his family. And this is where many readers, rightly, feel the ground shift beneath them, because it seems to suggest that the book is a morality tale after all. Be faithful under suffering, and God will reward you. Which seems to prove the friends right. And to undercut everything, the poem spent 35 chapters arguing. But look carefully at what the ending does and does not say. It never says the new children replace the old ones. It never says Job forgets what was taken. It never explains the suffering. Not a single word of explanation is offered. The adversary disappears from the story entirely and is never mentioned again. The questions raised in the heavenly courtroom are never answered for Job. What Job receives at the end is not an explanation. He receives restoration. He receives continuation. He receives more life. And perhaps, and this may be the most honest reading of the ending, that is all that any of us ever actually receive. Not answers. Life. The ending is not a reward for good behavior. It is a demonstration that life continues after the unanswered question. Job never gets a why. He gets a who, and then he gets to keep living. What Job is really saying? Let me be precise about what this book is and is not saying. It is not saying that suffering always has a reason you will one day understand. The friends believed that. God sided with Job. It is not saying that faith means accepting pain without question or protest. Job questioned, loudly, persistently, at length, for 35 chapters. And God called him right. It is not saying that good people do not suffer. That is precisely, definitively, what the book disproves from its very first chapter. What it is saying, carefully, honestly, without tying things up too neatly, is something like this. The world is genuinely more complex than our explanations of it. Suffering is real. Innocent suffering is real. There is no formula, no prayer, no behavior, no theology that will fully protect you from it or satisfactorily explain it when it arrives. And yet, the honest cry is better than the pious silence. The raw question is more faithful than the comfortable answer. The person who sits in the ashes and argues with heaven is, somehow, stubbornly, against all expectation, closer to the truth than the person who has everything figured out. That is the thesis of this entire video. The honest cry is more faithful than the pious silence. Think about the people in your own life who have been through real hardship. The ones who lost a child, buried a spouse, received a diagnosis that changed the shape of everything. The ones who are honest about how hard it is, who don't reach for the easy comfort, who sit with the weight of it rather than rushing past it. Don't they feel more trustworthy than the ones who have all the answers? Don't their words carry a weight that easy comfort never quite manages? Job is the book for those people. It is the book for anyone who has ever felt that the gap between what life promised and what life delivered was simply too wide to paper over with a verse. It does not close that gap, but it says, clearly, honestly, with the full weight of 3,000 years behind it, you are not alone in it. Your honesty is not a failure. Your questions are not a betrayal. There's a reason this book has survived for thousands of years, not because it offers easy comfort or neat explanations, but because it tells the truth. It shows what suffering really feels like in the middle of it, uncertain, unresolved. It shows what faith looks like under pressure, raw, strained, barely holding on. And in the end, it offers not answers, but presence. Job 19:25. I know that my Redeemer lives. Job doesn't say he understands. He says he isn't abandoned, that this isn't the end. If you're in a season where questions are louder than answers, this book is for you. Not to fix it, but to remind you. You're not alone. And that is enough. If this gave you a new perspective, hit like. It helps others find it. For deeper, honest Bible discussions, subscribe and turn on the bell. See you in the next video.